which is sponsored by Rathbones, one of the leading charity investment managers in the UK, and whose support enables us to offer these free sessions. Thank you for joining us today, and just to note that this session will be recorded. And as we might cover some issues here that maybe you'd like to ask follow-up questions about in a more confidential space, then do feel free to get in touch with us directly at inquiries@scvo.gov after this. We'll send out the slides to you from all our speakers following the webinar and links to further resources in a follow-up email. As we're getting started, can I encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat and just highlight your main safeguarding questions and concerns. So today we have a great selection of speakers that will help you get safeguarding right in your organisation. We've all seen the tabloid headlines about charities who are household names and have got safeguarding very wrong. That had a devastating effect on their beneficiaries, their work and their reputation. But not only that, it also impacted our sector long term. So that's why safeguarding has to be proactive and go over and above the minimum legal responsibilities, so you can protect your beneficiaries and everyone who comes into contact with your organisation. So I'm delighted that we have with us today Robin Fallis, who is a partner at Mac Roberts, and they're one of the firms who are part of SCVO's free legal advice service. Robin has supported SCVO members for many years and will take us through the key legal duties of a charity trustee and good governance and safeguarding. After Robin, Tom Burke will tell you about the practical side of safeguarding and the kinds of policies and procedures you need to think about. Tom has co-authored guides on safeguarding and the law and is a safeguarding trainer for our sister organisation in London, SCVO. And I'm also delighted to announce that he'll be running a new course for SCVO on the 24th of May, which is called An Introduction to Safeguarding. And there'll be a link going up for that to book, but I'll also send you details in a follow-up email. And then last, but certainly not least, will be Laura Anderson from OSCR, the charity regulator. Laura is Senior Manager, Higher Risk Cases and Quality Assurance, and is going to tell you more about OSCR guidance and the notifiable events scheme. Okay, so enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to Robin to get us started. And if you want to share your screen, Robin, but as I say, do use the chat as we go to ask questions, and we'll have time to cover these at the end. Thanks, Robin.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. I will check that my screen is working in a second. Hi, I'm Robin Fallis. I'm a charity law specialist, and as Tracy has said, I work closely with the SCVO. My role today is just to give a quick overview of trustees' duties in the safeguarding context. So again, what is safeguarding? We have up here the OSCR guidance definition of that, and you'll hear more from Laura soon. Actions that organisations take to promote the welfare of children, vulnerable adults, to protect them from harm. And in terms of why this matters, I think the key thing that I would like to emphasise is that it's the last bit. Charities should be able to demonstrate that they can keep people safe through processes to show that they meet their trustees' duties. I'd like to say a little bit then in context about the trustees' duties, although annoyingly I'm having some difficulty in moving my slide on. Here we go. So trustees, the board of a charity. I use this slide quite often to emphasise the different sort of duties that come into play. We have the charity law duties, more on them in a second. Depending on your organisation, if it's a company, you have company law duties. I'm not going to say a lot about those today. And finally, we have the common law duties that apply irrespective of charity law. And I'd just like to emphasise sort of for today, the charity law duties are the key ones in terms of third-party care and diligence, and the other one relevant to safeguarding is a duty of care, just a general duty of care, a duty not to be negligent at common law, and that's something that can come into play if an incident happens, if there's a failure relevant to the charity potentially being sued or whatever else, separate to the action that the regulator might take, which Laura will be talking about separately. So in summary, charity trustee duties, yes, they're in play, talking about them, but also in safeguarding that duty of care angle separate to charity law. And when I use this slide, I quite often talk about duties that are easy to cover off with a timetable or a review check, and those are the ones that have just popped up green. And I quite often talk about those where it's important to document decision taking and the taking of advice. I think a point I will emphasize in the coming slides is that for safeguarding, it's really about being proactive and keeping things under a monitoring all the time. It's not a static thing. It's not putting in place a policy and forgetting about it. So that's the real theme I'd like to draw out as against that. Briefly, then to the trustees' duties. I've already mentioned that the key one that comes into play when it comes to safeguarding is the duty to act with the care and diligence that's reasonable to expect of a person who's managing the affairs of another. It's a duty that charity law places on charities that is a higher level of care than is applicable generally out there. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. Not really going to cover on the other three basic duties that are on the slide, but that when it comes to safeguarding, it is perhaps worth emphasizing the first one. Trustees need to show that they've acted in the interests of the charity, and naturally it's the interests of the charity to make sure that they're doing all that they can for vulnerable people, all that they can to ensure that there's that safe, ensuring safe environment free of harm. So it links into that. I'm not going to say any more on the other two duties. They're relatively straightforward, acting in accordance with the Constitution and complying with the regulator. More on that shortly from Laura. So yes, acting with that, it's a higher standard for care and diligence. You have to make sure you meet legal requirements. We talked about a duty of care, and it's exercising effective control over staff and volunteers. They are three of the things from the OSCR guidance that are worth highlighting when we're specifically talking about safeguarding. And as we'll see in the next few slides, it's about sort of creating a governance sort of risk matrix where the trustees can show, look, we were aware of our duty, we were aware of safeguarding and the need to have proper processes. So this is the safety network we've put in place, the control network that we've put in place with staff, with volunteers, relevant to our operations, which shows that we meet that duty of care and diligence. Again, just as an introduction, why are we doing this as trustees separate to the legal duties? Because it's an area for huge reputational damage. Particularly those organisations that are working with children, working with young people, working with vulnerable people. And I've been in that position myself as a trustee of a charity operating internationally with young children. And again, the backdrop to that is you absolutely want to make sure that everything is in place, in addition to having peace of mind on your legal duties relevant to the reputation of the charity. Laura will talk a little bit more about OSCR's role, but naturally as charity trustees, you want to be able to show if there's a regulatory investigation or regulatory action that you have taken appropriate steps. And if you remember on that early slide, when I highlighted it, being able to demonstrate that you have the right processes in place, that's the importance there. And again, if you remember on the earlier slide, I had the common law duty of care in addition to the trustees' duties. For that reason, it's particularly important to be able to demonstrate, not just at the charity law level, but at the general duty of care level. And that latter one on duty of care, that's because there is potential for legal action separate to OSCR, for example, from someone who's suffered as a result of a safeguarding failure, whether an individual who's within the organisation or out with the organisation. Okay, that's my scary lawyer bit about all our different duties. I've deliberately done it in a brief format because we have two other speakers who are going to sort of elaborate and go into sort of practical examples. I wanted to give my own take on how I see myself as a charity trustee and what I've done, and through my work in terms of helping clients put in place the appropriate mechanisms to make sure that they meet their duties. I wanted to just show that in picture format. And I mentioned before that when it's safeguarding, we don't want a static policy. We want active measures to make sure that as an organisation, we're on top of all the protections. And the way I think of it is, starting point is often the risk matrix of a charity that's setting out who's responsible, what are they assisted by, where does responsibility lie, what are the tools. And this takes you from an initial area where a charity might have risk to a position where the charity has sight of, the trustees can see how it is that they're dealing with the risk. And again, remember what I said before about being in a position to demonstrate the measures that have been taken. And quite simply, linking it back to what I said before, that's the tool that takes you from an area where you've got a trustee duty, you've got that duty of care, to being able to demonstrate that the duty is met. So the risk matrix comes in at that level. And where you get into problems as a charity, where we see the problems arising, is where they've not taken the step of working out the risks, or they've not put in place appropriate measures to meet that risk, which I think Tom will talk about, or where there's a particular delegation down to a member of staff to follow through on something that's not being followed, or indeed where there's a process that's not being followed through on. And again, you know, that for me, that emphasizes this idea of it's never a sort of static tick the box on safeguarding. It's always got to be a fluid. We need to keep a monitoring brief on how we're doing on this. It needs to be active. Another way I think of largely saying the same thing, but I find it quite useful to think about it, is the duty on the trustees is to sort of make a safety net for how the charity operates. And quite often you'll have a chief executive or staff who are operating that, or it may be in volunteers, and there'll be others involved in how that safety net works. And over time, you'll get weaknesses. You'll identify things that have gone wrong. There might be been a particular incident that wasn't covered by your existing mechanisms to deal with risk. And where those arise, again, you want the board to be able to identify those. So that quite often takes you down to this active level of, okay, have we had any issues with how our safeguarding policy's been operating? Have we had feedback from the staff or volunteers? Are there things going wrong? Because if so, we need to react to those. And again, just to emphasize that and emphasize the point about active meeting of trustee duties, you want that operational communication. Sometimes it's internal review, trustees and staff, trustees and volunteers. Sometimes it's external review, experts such as Tom or others, getting updates from them on what's needed and taking that advice. So finally, again, just to emphasize that same point again of getting the trustees' duties at the top, the board, all the way down to the vulnerable individuals at the bottom. Where you have the weaknesses, where the trustees risk being in breach of duties, is where there's no review of risks, missing risks, outdated, or they're not understood, or particular actions aren't taken, documentation is weak, or indeed it's a static policy that's then not followed up on. And you migrate to a better place where you've got a really well and good functioning risk register. It's treated as a live document, you know, clear training, clear responsibilities, clear processes for operational feed-in, and clear points for communication with, importantly, it being kept under review. So I have hopefully, in that very brief run through, my remit, which was to give the context of trustees' duties to safeguarding, and also to give a little bit of a take on, from my perspective, from the lawyer's perspective, of the things that come into play in a sort of legal framework, governance framework, risk framework to deal with those. And having done that, I'm going to hand you over to Tom as the next of the two individuals who are going to go into further detail on that. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for that, Robin. My name is Tom Burke. As I said, Tracy introduced earlier, I'm working with SCVO to support some development of new training. And today I want to be able to build on what Robin said and start to kind of look at how we actually embed a positive safeguarding culture across the charity. And that's partly because when we think about what's been in the newspaper headlines over the past few years, they've not always been the issues we wish would come to light for safeguarding in charity. What started as concerns in international development charities has led to a much wider range of concerns around how charities are led, how they're supporting people, and about the risks of harm. It's led to parliamentary inquiries, regulations, and a real shift and a change. And part of that, as Robin highlighted, is OSCR has issued new guidance back in 2018 around its approach to managing safeguarding and the duties of trustees and organizations, primarily focused around promoting the welfare of children and vulnerable adults, but also recognizes that there are wider responsibilities that as any trustees, you need to be considering the relationships you build and the ways in which you protect people in general and how you consider and promote well-being and welfare. And when we think about the reality of implementing safeguarding, it's important to recognize that it's about the way in which we are thinking about everybody in contact with the organization, but particularly mindful of those with unique needs and particular rights violations that they may experience. That it's a culture that will affect everybody and everybody will have a role to play. In a sense, everybody plays the same kind of football net that Robin just described, but the way we may do so may be different depending on the role that we have in the organization. When we're thinking about that, it's partly because there's no one fixed definition even of safeguarding, that can vary across sectors, depending if we're working with delivering in public sector organizations with children or adults at risk of harm. Generally speaking, across the whole of different types of sectors, when we think about safeguarding, we're thinking about the ways that we are proactively preventing harm, about putting in place the mechanisms that are proportionate to the type of relationships that we're building, and often range that broad range of legal duties that we have. Robin mentioned there are duties of care that we may have in common law and more widely. Within that, we'll be able to identify those individuals who are experiencing or at risk of harm, abuse, and neglect, and ensuring that they have the ability to get the support they need from the specialist agencies who have the legal powers and obligations and duties to be able to act. Those organizations will often have strict legal basis and powers to be able to do things that at the charity may not be appropriate or right for us to do so. So for charities, we need to be thinking primarily about how we are proactively preventing harm for the people to which we're working with, and identifying those people who may be in need of protection more widely. And that's partly because each charity will be having a different part of the safeguarding puzzle, because there is this broad range of duties that will apply. And often it's about thinking about who we are as a charity, the work that we deliver, who we have contact with, and therefore the types of obligations that may flow from the activities and engagement that we have. So there is a really broad range of different types of duties, and you need to be considering which are most relevant to you and for the work that you are delivering. And it may be unique depending on the type of activities that you're engaged in. Not just one law on safeguarding. It's about recognizing the broad ways in which we as an organization will undertake our work can create liabilities and risks of harm. And we need to be mindful of that as we consider the risks that we need to be able to mitigate and to be able to manage. And those laws also reflect the way that safeguarding has continued to evolve and change. So come with me on a journey. When we think a bit about OSCR's guidance there, some of our earliest laws for protecting children go all the way back to 1889, where duties were placed on local authorities and others to be able to prevent cruelty to children and intervene. And it started a conversation in society about what the balance between the independence of the family and individuals was, and the role of public protection and ensuring people are kept safe. And that balance has continued to echo through when we think about the realities of safeguarding. How do we make sure that people are able to live the life they want to that's free, whilst also protecting them from issues of harm? By the mid-1990s, our laws were codified and remain in force to be able to say that it is primarily the duty of local authorities to make inquiries where they reasonably suspect a child is at risk of harm. and they should do so in a way that supports the family to be able to meet their duties towards the child. And within that, we need to be considering that there'll be a wide range of different types of roles that statutory services that can play, and charities may support them in doing so. They can only do so if they're identified and we're able to inform them about those that we think may be at risk of harm or in need of additional support. When we are thinking about our duties for children, we are thinking about those individuals under the age of 18. That's codified in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and our child protection laws. There are sometimes some differences, particularly for 16 and 17-year-olds, because they have unique rights to be able to be involved in decision-making. But we should be thinking proactively about how we keep everybody under the age of 18 to be able to grow up under the kind of rubric of Shinari, about a safe, healthy, active, achieving, respected, responsible, and included space. Within that, we will need to have an approach that particularly ensures that we are looking at the consideration, assessment, and planning of those individuals who may be at risk of harm. So it is about the proactive ensuring that all children we have contact with are kept safe, and identifying those who may be entitled to statutory protection and ensuring that our partners there are able to act. It was later that laws were codified for adults at risk of harm, in particular those who have a need for care and support due to disability, maybe frailty due to age. And there's been a wide range of other types of legal duties that have come in place depending on the activities that organisations may deliver. So those working in supporting in the criminal justice system, any residential care, health and social care, mental health support. Those areas that particularly outside of mainstream community provision will have a higher standard of expectation of the way in which they are managing the risks that they face in their organisation. So adults at risk are those individuals aged 16 or over who are unable to safeguard their own well-being, property rights, or others' interests, and are at risk of harm because they are affected by that disability. So those things are linked back to how we have to be mindful of those particular groups of adults that we may have contact with, who are in those situations of a need for care and support, who may be affected by these issues and unable to safeguard their own well-being. Beyond those two groups that are more conventionally thought of issues of safeguarding, as Robin highlighted, there are broader duties of trustees to be able to act reasonably throughout their activities. We have duties around harassment and the Equality Act when we're in contact with people, about the ways which we do not face discrimination, and the OSCR guidance from 2018. There's a wide range of other duties that come about working online, working overseas, issues of finance and fraud, and how we respond in emergencies, issues around radicalization and terrorism. So it's an evolving and changing concept that will vary across each of the organizations on this call. And it's increasingly there can be duties that can arise that are beyond the traditional groups of just vulnerability to children and adults at risk of harm, and more widely the ways in which we are thinking about building a culture which is safe for everybody in contact with the organization. Building that safeguarding culture, though, isn't just something that just exists because we think about it. It's about the ways we behave and act. We're able to develop our work around safeguarding and build that culture by making sure we have proportionate, appropriate, and followed sets of policies and procedures. So these are really tools that enable us to be able to build the culture. They don't do them in and of themselves. They set a public statement about the ways in which we want to act. They hold ourselves and others to account for what we want to do. And they provide direction internally for those acting on our behalf to know what they should do, when, and how. These are tools that enable us to be able to build that culture. They can only be implemented well if we have a wide range of training, guidance, and support that gives staff, volunteers, and others who are acting on our behalf the knowledge, the skills, and the confidence to be able to implement those in full. That should then be embedded through the ways we have practices and supervision of staff. So it's not just about, can you write it down on a piece of paper? It's, can you demonstrate people are skilled and able to do so, and then are supervised and able to ensure that the quality of the way they meet those duties is sufficient amongst the level of standard that you have set, or to which you have a legal obligation. And how are you regularly reporting on the progress you're making, reflecting on the work that you're doing, and learning from the work that you have been undertaking. Safeguarding isn't fixed, and you will be growing your approach over time. Now, all of this needs to be proportionate to the size and scale of your organization. While there are laws that can apply to all organizations in a regulatory context, from OSCR and others, there's such a variety of the types of organizations and types of charitable activities and the purposes that we pursue. So we need to be thinking that our approach to safeguarding should be proportionate to our size and scale, to the types of legal structure that we have, the activities and the risks that you face. Identifying where we know where we have a legal or regulatory duty to be able to act, where we set as a board a kind of clear policy commitment that we want to be able to ensure that we are meeting, and that we're in scale with others who are delivering in our sector, particularly the more specialist activities that we have, or the more contact we may have with those conventional groups of children or adults at risk of harm. How are we making sure we are kind of on a like-minded basis with others who have learned about what is working to keep those groups safe? So there will be a different approach and a different proportionate approach to safeguarding for different types of charities because of what you do, how you act, where you act, your size and scale, and the risks you face. It's not just a one-size-fits-all. There are some common duties that apply to all organizations. How you meet that will be variable depending on who you are as an organization. So what are some of the practical building blocks? What I want to turn to now is talk about some of the things that organizations have done to be able to embed that safeguarding culture. So what are the tools that they might be using? What are the practices they may be developing? And how does that work? Well, perhaps Robin has already mentioned that this should be focused on issues of risk. So you do need to be able to ensure that you can demonstrate that you have identified and managed the risks that you have in place. But also, how do you know the way that you're trying to mitigate those risks are fit for purpose? Who has oversight of that risk? Who makes sure that the way in which you are meeting that is being kind of tested and quality assured to be sufficient? How are you making sure you're regularly updating if your activities are changing or you're meeting new types of client groups that may change your risk profile? When we all shifted online during the pandemic, that opened up new types of risks because we operated in a different environment. Did our safeguarding approach keep up with that? And have, when we've embedded that, continued to keep in touch? Policies and procedures are those useful tools that we can use to be able to provide clarity on our approach to safeguarding that's unique to us and the risks we face. So there will be that a safeguarding policy that outlines your approach to safeguarding, your public commitment of what you'll be doing to keep people safe, and the procedures that those on the organization should be implementing that, particularly about how they manage concerns or how they embed safer recruitment practices. Key thing is that those policies and procedures should be relevant, clear to you, and put into practice. It's no point just going online, finding a template, control, copy, change, adding different name. It should be based upon the risk that you have and the types of mitigations that are most relevant to you and your work. Those policies and procedures should be updated regularly, and many organizations will try to do so on an annual basis. And that gives an opportunity for the board just to stop and pause and ask itself, has anything changed in our activities? Has there been new or emergent risks? What have we learned over the past year? And what does that mean about what more we could do to embed the way we keep people safe going forward? And certainly, if you do have any serious incident or concern, you should be asking yourself if there's any lessons learned from that may mean that you could better prevent it by changing the current policy or procedures that you have in place. Many organizations will adopt a named safeguarding lead to be the champion of the organization and deal with the operational provision of keeping people safe. They may receive concerns about children and adults at risk of harm who may be in contact with the organization, and there's concern that they may be in need of additional forms of protection or support. And that gives them an overview of all types of concerns in the organization. And they can be the best conduit then onto statutory services or others where a referral might be needed, or signposting individuals to other charities and support groups that may be relevant. It's about accountability, that person knows it's their role to do it, and it provides clarity to the rest of the organization about who they can turn to should there be a worry. But they never act alone. Now, while that operational role of a named safeguarding, or sometimes called a designated safeguarding lead, may be in place, you do need to ensure there is that board ownership and oversight. What are the ways Robin's mentioned about having things such as external organizations coming to do reviews? Can you do the board level review? Some boards will adopt its own kind of champion for safeguarding at that board level lead. In the same way, we may have a finance manager or a finance director who produces the accounts and the treasurer who takes more work to be able to scrutinize. You might be able to have a operational name safeguarding lead and a board level lead who's there to champion and to be able to understand more about the sphere. But it is the board collectively that remains in control for these decisions. You need to be considering where you're working and if the spaces you're working are fit for purpose for the types of risks that you may face and the client group that you're working with. You need to be considering the ways in which online harms through your activities around social media or workshops or other forms of online delivery. We've got a new online harms bill that will be going through, and there are changes afoot about expectations around how we all manage ourselves online in parts of the UK. You need to be considering about what's proportionate for you in your recruitment process. And that really will depend about the degree of contact you have with children and adults at risk of harm. And within that, you identifying if you do need to undertake any form of disclosure checks for individuals who are acting on your behalf. There's different rules in place and different levels of criminal information may be shared about someone's history. So it will vary depending on the type of activities you do, but you should be able to ask yourself for any role, paid or unpaid, is it proportionate or necessary for us to hold this information? And if so, have we gone through the right legal steps to be able to gain that? Once people are in place, are you clear with them about the expectations you have on the behavior that you might need to be expecting them to have? What are the code of conduct that you would expect for them to be able to have that's proportionate to the type of activities that you do and the risk that you face? So it's not about saying you want this big yellow pages of a set of rules and procedures. It should be led by the values you have as an organization. But the more they are in higher risk roles with children or adults at risk of harm, the more clarity you should provide about the expectations of their behaviors. And therefore, if they fail to do so, you can hold them accountable for that. People need the skills and knowledge to be able to meet those standards. So how are you in inducting people, making them aware of how anybody can raise a concern? But again, the higher the risk related to that individual role, the more that you should offer them the training and support to meet those duties. If you work with third-party organizations and you commission them to act on your behalf, or where you offer a grant to them, have you considered the ways in which you undertake due diligence of those organizations to ensure that they are safe and suitable for the activities you're supporting them to be able to do so? Are you clear about how any safeguarding issues between you and a partner organization will be managed and what the distinct responsibilities you may have in that partnership would be? How are you making sure that everybody connected to your organization knows how they can share a concern? If an intended beneficiary of your organization had a worry about a member of staff, who would they turn to? If there was a member of staff who was concerned about the behavior of another, who would they turn to? How would you make sure that everyone is aware of how they can act if they've got concerns about safeguarding in your organization? Incidents can happen. Charities are often in touch with people who are experiencing harm in their lives. And sadly, we may also be targeted by those who seek to join our organizations to create opportunities to cause harm. The key thing is we manage those incidents well, that we do so with dignity for all involved, that we are considerate of the views and experiences of those who may be affected, and we act in a way that is swift and proportionate to the relationships that we hold. That does mean that we may need to ensure that we manage information securely, meeting our data protection obligations, and if necessary, notifying any regulators that we may be involved in. We'll hear more from Oscar in a moment, but depending on the type of activities you do, there may be other regulatory bodies that you may need to be informing due to the safeguarding concern. And sometimes your grant or contracts that you have with a public sector organization or a funder may also require some form of information notification to them. All of these are just building blocks. And as I said, it does need to be proportionate to you, your size, your scale. These are things you might want to consider. The size and scale of your safeguarding house will depend about the types of activities you deliver. These are just some of the things you might want to consider. As I end today, we started by talking about some of the headlines about how safeguarding has gone wrong. But I also want us to recognize how actually for many charities, they are the people who are raising and support issues of harm in society. They're the ones advocating for laws that better protect us and others. They are the people who are acting to be able to keep people safe. So yes, there are building blocks we have, but let's also recognize that actually it's the charity sector who's so often been the people who have enabled those experiencing harm to be heard, to be better supported. And there's a wealth of experience you can draw on as you build forward your approach to safeguarding. On that, I think, there'll be more of this explored in our new training with SCVO, and there's a link in the chat box already. And happy to take any questions in the file. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. Just while Laura's getting set up there, there was a question came in quite early. And I think you probably already answered this, but how often do you need to give your staff and volunteers safeguarding training, and who should deliver it, apart from your good self?
If I maybe go in that first, I would say, so it may depend a little bit about what kind of roles you've got in your organization. So I would suggest that any organization at induction should make sure that everybody connected to the organization understands its safeguarding policy, understands what the organization is doing to be able to keep people safe, and importantly, who do they turn to if they have a concern? Beyond that, it should be led by the risks of the individual role that they have. So the more that the role is working with particular groups, the more in-depth the training will need to be. So if they have responsibility for children or adults at risk of harm, their types of training will be different than perhaps the finance manager who never has any contact. So there should be a baseline for everybody, understand our commitments, the core legal responsibilities, and who they do turn to. And then those in roles where they have more direct relationships to with different groups, they should get the training that's proportionate to manage those kind of risks. So again, it's not really a one size fits all. I think it will depend about you just being thoughtful and really thinking through what kind of roles do we have in our team? Where would they have exposure to risks? And therefore, what type of training would be proportionate to know that we feel confident they know what to do, both in to proactively prevent harm and to identify and respond to those they may be in contact with who are experiencing harm.
Great, thanks, Tom. Okay, Laura, over to you.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I'm almost, I guess, starting the session thinking, what left is there for me to say? Because number one, this is a very unusual situation for me to kind of speak last at an event. I normally have the kind of privilege of speaking first and kind of setting the scene. Coming last is a very different experience, and I'm actually thinking, what can I usefully add that Robin and Tom haven't covered very eloquently already? I think the best thing I can do is to help you understand about where you can perhaps access further information, where you can seek further guidance, and particularly talk about the views that OSCR has about the expectations of charities and indeed the notifiable events regime. So that's what I'm going to do for the next few minutes. Robin and Tom have really, I would say, set the scene quite perfectly for us here in terms of kind of explaining the importance of safeguarding in the context of the legal duties that charity trustees have, the implications, obviously, of kind of getting the approach wrong, and certainly some of the practicalities, I guess, in terms of how charities need to handle safeguarding. So let me see what I can maybe add as the icing on the cake to that. So I'm going to talk first then about OSCR's safeguarding guidance. And if you haven't seen this, you can print it from our website quite easily. You don't have to print it in all its glorious technicolor. You can print it in good old-fashioned black and white as well. But equally, you can read it online as well. The guidance, I would say, is very much designed for those charities that work with vulnerable beneficiaries and people who work with the charity trustees of those charities. And it's designed, I guess, to really engender really strong understanding of the relevant responsibilities within these charities in terms of how they operate. So let's just be clear again who it is that we're kind of talking about when we talk about vulnerable beneficiaries. This has already been covered. I think it's worth just reiterating so everyone's clear. So we're talking in the context of our guidance about a child being anyone under 18 years of age, and vulnerable adults who are over 16 years of age but are unable to safeguard themselves, their property and their rights. So that's the vulnerable beneficiary group that we're talking about here. Now, in some charities, and bear in mind, we've got 25,000 odd charities, 25,000 odd charities in Scotland, with enormous variation in terms of the beneficiary groups that they have, the activities that they engage in. Now, in some charities, safeguarding can be something that's relatively narrow, I guess, in terms of focus. In others, it can be very, very broad and everything in between. For example, a charity that's got vulnerable beneficiaries who also work within the charity, either on a paid or a voluntary basis, those people in that capacity, either as an employee or a volunteer, also need to be safeguarded. So it's not purely always about people who are directly benefiting from a distinct activity that the charity is undertaking. It can also be about vulnerable people who are benefiting this maybe a slightly different way from their involvement in the charity. And that would then need to be taken into account alongside the employment or the volunteering responsibilities that the charity has. So that's a good example of how sometimes it can be a bit broader than you might originally anticipate. Now, let me be clear, the OSCR guidance doesn't cover all the ins and outs of what charity trustees need to do in relation to safeguarding issues. For example, it doesn't go into a lot of detail about employment law issues. If it did, it would need to be probably about at least 20 pages, 20 times longer than it is, I would say. What it's designed to do is to give you some good sort of general principles and pointers to where you can get further information and to enable you to really have a good developed understanding of the basics. Okay, so that's what it's designed to do. Often with a specific topic, whether it's safeguarding, whether it's about conflict of interest, whether it's about accounts, whatever it is, knowing where to go for some further information, some further guidance is actually a key thing, not necessarily knowing everything that there is to know about it in one go, because the chances are you'll forget it maybe when you need it most anyway. Okay. Basic principle to remember that any charity working with children, vulnerable, protected adults, is that they need to do everything that they can to keep those people safe and to protect them from harm. And I think this really strongly links into the point that Tom was making about organisational culture. It's about having that strong ethos, that strong understanding of the importance of how the charity behaves, how it engages, how it communicates, all of these things. It should really underpin all of that together. Now, the guidance that we've got provides some good examples of things that can be done by a charity to help protect vulnerable beneficiaries. Again, some of these have already been alluded to, but I'm just going to kind of underline a couple that I think are worth maybe repeating. We talked earlier, Tom talked quite a bit there about having policies and procedures in place to help protect those people from harm. But as we all know, having a policy on its own in place isn't sufficient, okay? You can have the best policy in the world, but if you gold plate it, laminate it, stick it in a cupboard and no one ever reads it again, that's not doing an awful lot for your organisation. The most important thing is that the policy and the procedures that support that policy are properly implemented and that everybody that needs to understand them in that charity does so. Now, I'm a simple girl at heart, so I always advocate that if you're developing a policy, you're developing some procedures, keep them simple, because actually complexity can really be your enemy here, I would suggest. If you keep them simple, keep them practical, and very much keep them appropriate to your organisation, that's when you've got the much better chance of them being successfully implemented, successfully used, and people acting in a way that really fulfills the kind of the concepts behind them and the ethos behind them. And that, as I say, that's a point, therefore, that Robin, Tom, and I have all made to you today. It's not just about having it, not just about developing it and having a one-time only conversation. It's the importance of keeping up to date, keeping sure it's relevant, flexing it, adapting it when you need to. Okay, all I think really, really important points to bear in mind there. The other thing I would particularly highlight is it's really important that the charity trustees are able to receive and deal with any concerns that anybody has about safeguarding within the charity. And that means there needs to be a way of doing that everybody understands. So let me unpick that just for a minute. So that means there needs to be a process, number one, that those people that have concerns about safeguarding can understand, and also that the charity trustees themselves understand and that they stick to. And these two things together mean that concerns hopefully are dealt with properly and in a way that others then feel confident in, and therefore people feel protected and safe, or that others are being protected and feel safe in their interactions with the charity. Okay, so again, it's about keeping it simple, making sure everybody understands what's going on there. I can't overemphasize that. The guidance on pages sort of 8 and 9, if you happen to be having a look at it, has also some really good sort of top tips, which are both practical and I think helpful in relation to safeguarding. And I would particularly say that if your charity is perhaps one that's newly having to consider safeguarding issues, maybe because it's moving into different activities or working with beneficiaries that it hasn't worked with before, then that's a really good place maybe to start having conversations around your trustee table about what changes you might need to put in place, what things you need to start to discuss or to think about that you might not have had to do previously. So all of those things I think are worth having a little look through the guidance for. Now, this brings me on to what I've described here as kind of safeguarding at the charity's heart. And I suppose in terms of almost like the subtitle, the context for this slide, it's really about what does OSCR expect of a charity in this space. I think very much for me, this links back to the point that Robin made right at the top of the event today, which is about acting in the interests of the charity. Okay, if you're a charity that is working with vulnerable beneficiaries, then acting in the interest of your charity will mean that you have safeguarding right at the very heart of everything that you think about doing in your organisation. Whether that's about how you might procure services, whether it's about how you communicate with people, or indeed whether about how you hold your meetings or how you deliver directly your charitable activities, it should underpin everything almost. Now, where relevant to an organisation, safeguarding is really about, I guess, supporting the charity in many ways to deliver its charitable activities in a way, again, that is safe and protected for those relevant beneficiaries. It allows those people to access the support and the work that your charity is doing that those people ultimately need. Okay, and it allows those people to engage with the charity in a way that they are protected, safe, and they feel protected and safe as well. Lastly, and again, this very much links to the point that Tom made earlier, was all the kind of different headlines, the news headlines that we've seen in recent years. It is about protecting the reputation of the charity as well, because getting it wrong can have very, very severe consequences for an organisation. And for some, it can be consequences that an organisation will never, ever be able to recover from. So it is a really critical area to make sure that you get right in every sense of the word. But that said, the approach that your charity takes has got to be suitable and proportionate to the organisation, and be that whether about the activities, beneficiaries, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to be that the policy that perhaps a small organisation who has relatively limited income and is working with very, very small group of beneficiaries, that policy that they have and that they're using does not have to be the same as something that a household name charity is using. In fact, I would suggest it's best for it not to be the same thing, because it just won't be effective. It won't be understood and it won't work on a practical level. Think about what you need to do in your charity and make it work for you. That brings me on to the final slide then about the notifiable events regime that we operate at OSCR. Now, when we talk about the notifiable events regime, we talk about the expectation that we have that charity trustees will tell us at OSCR when an event happens in their organisation that's likely to have a major impact on the charity. So there's obviously the relevant example in this context about a significant incident maybe involving a child or a vulnerable adult that happens in a charity. That's something that we would class as a notifiable event that we would want you to tell us about, OSCR. Now, when we say that we want you to tell us about such an event under the notifiable events regime, that isn't so that one of us can come out and hit you over the knuckles with a big stick. That's absolutely the last thing that we're talking about here. In many ways, what we think is that reporting a notifiable event to us is actually a good positive demonstration of good governance, because it helps us to know that the charity trustees, number one, understand that an event has happened, that it is likely to have a major impact on their organisation, that they're getting a handle on it, or indeed maybe they've already got a handle on it and they're taking the appropriate steps to deal with the incident itself, and potentially putting steps in place to make sure that such an event doesn't recur if it's possible to mitigate that going forward. So by telling us about it, actually, Board of Charity Trustees can be saying to us, look at how good we are. We accept at OSCR that everybody is human, and charities are organisations that are run by human beings, just the same as OSCR is. Everybody gets things wrong occasionally, and sometimes incidents can happen through no fault of the charity trustees. The important thing is that the event is dealt with when it occurs, and it's dealt with in the right way. If in doubt, I would say contact us about what's happened in your organisation. If you're not very sure about something that's happened and whether it falls into the definition of a notifiable event or not, tell us about it. The worst thing that can happen in terms of maybe your kind of effort that you've put in to write the event to us is that maybe we'll write to you and say, you know, that's great, you know, we maybe didn't need to know about that, but thanks for the information anyway, or we'll keep the information on file. In very limited circumstances, we might engage with the charity to say, okay, we understand what's happened here, but what we need you to explain to us is what you're doing about it. And that can sometimes be because the trustees didn't understand that they were meant to explain that to us in making the report. Or maybe they're in the space at the moment where they haven't quite decided what they are going to do about it. They're actively having those discussions. And that might be because the report has come to us in a very short space of time after the incidents actually happened. We get quite a wide variety in terms of notifiable events that come to us, both in terms of the issues and the level of detail in terms of the content of the report that's made to us. Some are very detailed, some are very brief, some are made to us just very, very quickly after the incident has happened. Some are made slightly later on, and therefore the trustees are in a better position to tell us about the steps that they've taken to kind of mitigate the risk going forward. But as I say, the worst thing that can happen is that, you know, we would maybe say to you, you maybe didn't need to tell us about that. If we do need to engage with trustees further, because maybe we aren't very satisfied about what they're doing, we will tend to do that in a way that is supportive and facilitative, with reference to the guidance that we have available on our website as well. Of course, there could be very limited circumstances where our approach has to be different in order to manage a risk that perhaps the charity trustees aren't managing. But those situations, I would say, are very, very few and far between in terms of my experience at OSCR. And I've been with OSCR for some 16 years now. So I've seen a fair number of cases come across the desk. So as I say, if in doubt, report or contact us if you want to discuss further. I'll pop some links into the chat in just a little moment, both to the safeguarding guidance that we've got and also the guidance that we have about notifiable events as well. But hopefully you found that helpful. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Laura. That was great. And I would back up what Laura said. OSCR really are a proportionate and approachable regulator. So bear that in mind. If you do have any problems, let them know. We have had a couple of questions come into the chat, but we've got some time, so I would encourage you to keep them coming. I'm going to put this one to Robin. So somebody has asked from a funder, Cora. They fund many small groups, and some are constituted and some are not, and I presume they'll all have different legal structures. So Debbie's wondering what's reasonable and appropriate for these groups. Robin.
Thank you. I'll take this first. I'm sure Tom will come in on the point. I think Tom made the point that there isn't a one size fits all, and that you don't have different organizations with different resources and different abilities to have measures in place. I think if you're a funder dealing with very small organizations, you would still want to know that they have safeguarding on their agenda, and particularly if it's you know, they're working with vulnerable groups, you would want to see that they have they've thought about it a lot, and you would want to. So I think you would end up with a funding provision along the lines of you know, either proactively the organization provides you with an overview of how they deal with safeguarding, or you have a provision that says that they need to maintain and ensure they're following OSCR's guidance, something along those lines. I don't think you want to be prescriptive and say you need 50 pages of detail and to be considering at every meeting, because that might be overkill. Tom, do you want to come in on that too?
No, I totally agree with that in ethos and in spirit and the statement there. I think often what I would say is that when I've worked with funders in particular, it's about not placing yourself where you're becoming the judge and jury as to whether or not their safeguarding arrangements are adequate for their organization. What you're asking them to do is be able to demonstrate to you that they take safeguarding seriously, they've considered the risks, and that you feel that you are confident they've got a grip of control over safeguarding. It's their responsibility. There may be elements where kind of end use of the funds that you're giving them and type of relationship you're having, you may need to come to more of a clarity about where will these things go between us, you know, because different types of partnerships work in different ways. But I would just say it's really about having that active conversation with them where they just describe to you, how do you keep people safe in this organization? You don't have to make it a very overly onerous kind of complex element. The more complex the grant, the more the grant or contract may be working with at-risk groups, the more proportionate you might need to look at and more in depth some of that due diligence.
Thank you. And I think a common question that we get on the information services, can you just give me a model safeguarding policy? And I think all of our speakers today have answered the question why we can't really. It's not a one size fits all. So I've got a question for Tom. I'm going to come back to you. So how would you advise someone who has to challenge the views of someone maybe more senior than themselves in an organization in relation to maybe safeguarding concerns that they have?
So I would say two things about that. So again, your safeguarding procedure could have something that basically allows for escalation. So if I've got a concern about a child, a vulnerable adult, and it's connected to my organization, there should be clarity about where I go with that. But if that isn't working for me, if they don't feel that they're taking that concern seriously, is there a way that either internally I'm able to share that worry? And also recognizing that we may have legal protection if we needed to be able to whistleblow if we think the organization's overall approach to safeguarding is failing. So there's a difference between that. There's something which says, hang on a minute, I'm just a bit worried about this person. I've sent this information. Are we taking action on this? Am I escalating internally in line with our procedures? And your procedure should, you know, ideally highlight how you would do so. And then there's the issue, well, hang on, is there a systemic issue here where there is a real worry that the organization is not meeting its legal obligations? And I feel like, you know, I need to be able to share that in a way that's external to the organization. And we do have some legal protections in those circumstances to be able to do so. The other brief thing I would just say on that is that sometimes actually, often in my experience, what's more likely is it's charities trying to escalate within local authorities and others who are not always accepting the referrals and concerns that we have. So actually part of this is us being confident that we've got expertise, we've got skills, we know our communities well. And if we're worried that someone should be in touch with statutory services and they're not accepting that referral, we can also take steps with them to highlight our worry about that individual.
Okay, thank you. I haven't got any more questions in the chat, but as I said at the beginning, do contact inquiries at scvo.scot if you do want to ask any particular questions and you don't feel this is the forum to do that. We're coming to a close now, so I would just like to thank all of our speakers for the contributions today and to you all for taking part. As I said, you can book in for safeguarding training with Tom on our website. And we've also got another free webinar coming up at the end of next month on trustee roles and responsibilities. So do come along to that if you'd like a refresher, or maybe you've got some new trustees on your board. And whilst it might seem like a long way away, the gathering will be taking place on the 7th and 8th of November in Edinburgh. And that's in Trustees Week, and we'll be having a special focus on events for trustees. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on the kind of events you'd like to see there. So do get in touch if you've got any ideas. So thanks once again and goodbye.